Okay, so welcome to the final lecture in this unit on climate change and the probably one of the biggest issues. Well, maybe not the biggest issues right now, but easily an issue that's been on the forefront for quite a while right now. So, in terms of climate change, we are past the tipping point. The tipping point was this idea that we have gone beyond any fixable way of doing something. So technically, we are now beyond anything that we can fix. It's been damaged beyond repair at this point in terms of our um, sustainability on Earth, as well as what we have done for the environment. So climate change is not new. This is not something that's new. Temperatures have varied for hundreds of thousands of years. There have been multiple ice ages. The climate has changed drastically throughout time. So this is not a new idea or a new topic or anything to that effect. But what the problem is something called the greenhouse effect. And this is what we talk about most often. It's kind of the global warming. Global warming and the greenhouse effect are not the same thing. The greenhouse effect has existed for as long as Earth has an atmosphere, because with it, we wouldn't have life on Earth. Basically, the way the atmosphere functions on Earth is kind of like a greenhouse itself. So this is what this is. The atmosphere holds in the heat that allows us to then use it in order to sustain life on Earth. So that is what the greenhouse effect actually is. This idea that the global warming is something completely separate, that is the kind of the negative connotations, but the greenhouse effect is actually what sustains life on Earth. And there are greenhouse gases. Most of the Earth's atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. None of these gases are greenhouse gases. Rather, the gases that make up the remaining 0.1 are what we consider the greenhouse gases. So the most important greenhouse gas are water vapor, H2O, carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, CH4. The effect of the higher concentration of H2O is not clear, but the impact of carbon dioxide and methane is much clearer. Because human activities are increasing the magnitude of the greenhouse effect by producing more gases that cause it. So the anthropogenic greenhouse gases are the gases that we make as humans. 3 of them are naturally occurring, the CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, and 1 is completely man-made, which are halocarbons, and that's the specific man-made one. Let's see. So to understand climate change, it's critical to understand the carbon cycle and how carbon moves through the environment. So we're going to take a break here for a quick minute, and we're going to watch a little YouTube video about...
Carbon is one of the most important elements on Earth. All living things are made of carbon. Most of the fuels that humans use for energy are primarily made of carbon, including the food we eat. Gases made from carbon, such as carbon dioxide, play an important role in regulating climate. Biological activity causes carbon to be constantly converted among different forms and locations. These movements of carbon are referred to as the carbon cycle. The global carbon cycle describes the exchanges of carbon between the atmosphere, terrestrial vegetation, soils and organic matter, ocean, and fossil fuels. These exchanges are continually changing and not in perfect balance. Human activities are converting oil, coal, natural gas, plant and soil organic carbon into carbon dioxide, which is accumulating in our atmosphere, where it contributes to the greenhouse effect. The atmosphere is a relatively small reservoir of carbon, containing less than 1% of the Earth's total carbon pool. Because it's so small, even a slight increase in inputs to the carbon atmosphere can have a big impact on the total concentration over time. The amount of carbon in terrestrial vegetation is comparable to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Vegetation takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. However, the amount that humans continue to add through fossil fuel emissions is more than plants are able to use, so it accumulates in the atmosphere. The CO2 that plants are able to use becomes new plant tissue. Most of the plant tissue winds up naturally dying and falling to the ground to become plant litter and eventually is decomposed or transformed to soil organic matter. In many parts of the world, organic matter accumulates faster than it decomposes, adding to soil carbon pools. Within the soil, there is more than twice as much carbon locked up in organic material than there is carbon in the atmosphere. Human activities such as land use changes and greenhouse gas emissions accelerate the conversion of soil carbon to carbon dioxide. So why is this important? Carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse gas, which causes heat to be retained between the Earth and the atmosphere. Some radiation leaving the Earth's surface is trapped by greenhouse gases, causing heat to be retained. This happens because CO2 absorbs outgoing infrared radiation and re-emits it in all directions, including back down to the Earth's surface. This leads to increased temperatures in the lower atmosphere, which in turn can increase the rate of decomposition, which further increases the amount of atmospheric carbon. This creates a magnifying cycle of increased warming and increased atmospheric carbon. It's important to understand the overall exchanges of carbon to understand this process.
Now that you kind of understand the carbon cycle, the carbon source is anything that creates carbon. So that is vegetation in a swamp, decomposes and gives off methane. The carbon sink is anything that removes carbon from the atmosphere. So when you plant a tree, it then takes up, in general, carbon will stay in sink for a period of time for, could be days to centuries. And then fixed carbon is removed from the atmosphere for long periods of time. So any carbon removed for a very long period of time, for example, limestone or coal. And it's stuck in space, so fixed in the spot. The carbon cycle is influenced by, obviously, human activities. If a forest burns down or a cow burps, the carbon sink that is being trapped contains carbon atoms that will have been out in the atmosphere for a relatively short period of time. Much more worrying situation occurs when previously fixed carbon enters the atmosphere. So basically when gasoline or coal is burned and this is added to the atmosphere, this was fixed carbon that was not supposed to be in the atmosphere but has now been released into the atmosphere through human activities. The increased production of the anthropogenic greenhouse gases is directly related to the explosion in the world population, industrial revolution, and the burning of fossil fuels, which releases those fixed carbon areas. So that's kind of what you're looking at. So what has been the impact of climate change in terms of this issue? So the one that everyone kind of cites is the higher than average temperatures. This summer is a perfect example. This is the hottest summer ever on record in Canada right now. The changes in precipitation patterns, sea levels increase, ecosystem change, agriculture and food, health, also lower temperatures in places that generally don't have those low temperatures, human migration, and of course, global security. All these things are impacted by the climate. And you wouldn't think things like security, but it is true that it can affect security. So how can we fix this problem? So what can we do about this climate change in these issues that we have? Well, one of them is carbon tax, and it's basically a pollution tax. It puts fees on production, distribution, or use of fossil fuels based on how much carbon or their combustion emits. So basically the government puts a tax on you using these specific carbon things to release the carbon into the atmosphere. And this tax makes dirty fuels more expensive, and it encourages businesses and individuals to reduce their consumption of these. Carbon tax also makes alternative energy more cost competitive, cheaper pollution fees, and that sort of stuff. However, the issue with carbon tax is that it makes everything more expensive, which is kind of hard to do something about if you don't have the money to begin with. So the carbon cap and trade system, also known as emissions trading. So the cap on greenhouse gas emissions is a limit backed by science, basically companies pay penalties if they exceed the cap. So you only have so much you can release into the atmosphere, and if you do more than that, you have to pay for it. So the government sets the cap across a given industry. So the trade partner is a market for companies to buy and sell allowances to permit them to emit only a certain amount. Trading gives companies a strong incentive to save money by cutting emissions. Companies that cut their pollution faster can sell their allowances to other companies to pollute more, or bank them for future use. This cap typically declines over time, providing a growing incentive to be more and more efficient. But it's not a great idea because it doesn't really save anything. You're basically just same amount of pollution, just making more money by selling it off to someone else. So it's not great. So I'm going to show you a little video now about cap and trade, and it kind of explains it a little better as to what it is. So I'll let you watch that, and I'll be back in a minute.
I just ran across a rather disturbing statistic. Apparently, Americans have no idea what cap and trade is. When Rasmussen asked Americans what cap and trade was, most of them had no idea, and 29% of them said that it had something to do with regulatory reform on Wall Street. Only 24% said that it had anything to do with environmental issues. I thought maybe this EcoGeek could be of some service. Now you probably know what cap and trade is, but maybe you need a refresher course. And maybe you just want to share with your friends and family, so they too can have some idea about the most important environmental legislation ever. So, cap and trade in its simplest form, basically the government says to all of the companies in the country, we can only have this much of a certain pollutant. Well, that's the cap. We simply cannot have more than that much pollution. And if we do, we're gonna fine the crap out of all of you. Then the government distributes credits for the release of those pollutants to all of the companies that produce those pollutants. Ideally, they give the companies credits for less pollution than they're already polluting with, so then the companies either have to reduce their pollution or buy credits from someone else. If the company is able to reduce its pollution below its current credit level, then it can sell or trade away those credits to companies that are having a harder time. So basically, the government creates an artificial economic market in pollution. So then the amount of money that the companies are willing to spend decreasing their pollution is directly proportional to the amount of money it would cost them to buy the credits if they weren't able to reduce their pollution. Success! We have a new economic market and everyone wants to reduce their pollution! Wait, there are problems? We run into the first problem when we say that the credits are distributed. How are they distributed? There are two ways. Basically, there's grandfathering. And would you get credits based on the amount of pollution you're already producing? Which seems kind of lame to me. I mean, it's like, oh, you're the biggest polluter. Here, have the largest number of credits. Or two, they can be auctioned off. That's the way that the Obama administration is looking at doing it. They're actually hoping to have huge amounts of money generated by the auctioning off of these carbon credits. But economists are kind of like, wait a second, so you've created an artificial market and you're selling nothing for billions of dollars. Also, the polluting corporations don't like it at all. But to me, it seems like a fairly fair way to do things. The second problem with cap and trade is that yes, the money has to come from somewhere. So whatever sectors of the economy are doing all that pollution, the prices of their services are going to go up. So yes, gasoline prices and energy prices would increase. And if gasoline and energy prices are increasing, what we have, it's not a cap and trade system, it's a tax! It's a tax! Boo, taxes! Rah, rah, rah! I like my money! Don't take my money away! But it's certainly more popular than a straight carbon tax, and with good reason. First, we don't have to call it a tax. And people like that. Second, say there's one coal power plant that can reduce its emissions relatively easily, and there's another in which it would be extremely expensive to reduce its emissions. The coal plant that has an easy time can reduce its emissions twice over, and the coal plant that's having a hard time doesn't have to do it. So you get the same amount of reduction in the end, but the costs are much lower. Cap and trade systems have actually been used in America for a long time, mostly on sulfur dioxide, which is the stuff that causes acid rain. And since cap and trade legislation went into place on sulfur dioxide, energy prices have not increased substantially, but the emission of sulfur dioxide has gone down like 50% despite huge increases in power generation. So yes, it works! Well, it works for sulfur dioxide anyway. The question is, will it work for greenhouse gases? Hopefully, we will find out soon. The Obama administration hopes to have cap and trade legislation on the books by 2012. And from then on, the government can continually lower the cap, and that strong market in carbon credits should spur innovation in wind power, carbon sequestration, solar power, electric cars, and who knows what else! And that, my friends, is why I, as an eco-geek, am excited about cap and trade, and why America should, have some idea what I'm talking about. This is Hank Green from ecogeek.org.
So that is it for this slideshow, and that is it for the unit. We are finished. I know it was a bit boring. It was a bit about geography and not so much about world issues, but that's it for now. And I will see you guys in the next unit and in the next lecture.